And as some of you may know, the Trump administration has a new rule it's calling expedited removal. As Representative Diana DeJette tweeted, it should terrify us all. It will allow ICE officers to approach anybody in the U.S. without probable cause and demand they prove they're a citizen or have been in the U.S. for 2 years. If they can't, they're deported, no trial, no hearing. Now, my next guest is someone I always enjoy reading and talking to about history. She had some thoughts about it. Keri Merritt is a historian and writer based in Atlanta, Georgia. She is the author of Masterless Men, Poor Whites and Slavery in the Antebellum South. And we've had her on in the past to talk about Southern history, as she tweeted in response. Well, I can't use one of the words on the air, but this is some 1850s blank right here, quote unquote, prove who you are and we'll decide what's accepted as proof, and whispers, by the way, white people, and she goes on from there. But first of all, Keri, thanks for coming on the program.
Thank you so much for having me back.
Oh, it's always a pleasure to talk to you. And of course, when you said this is some 1850s blank right here, I wasn't the only one. The first thing that came to mind was the Fugitive Slave Act. And I don't know what else you were thinking of from that era, but there were overtones there clearly that you saw, disturbing overtones from our history, right?
Yes, unfortunately, the era that I study, the late antebellum period in the U.S. South, is all too relevant for pretty much everything we're going through today. And you're absolutely correct. The first thing a lot of people who are well-versed in American history thought of is the Fugitive Slave Act and what happens not only in the South, but in the North, because essentially this act forces everyone in America to be on the lookout for anyone that they think may be a fugitive slave. So essentially anyone who is not white or anyone who could possibly not be white is subject to search and seizure. And because of the times in America, in the 1850s, there was no right to a trial after this. And so people were arrested and immediately essentially sold into slavery. Many, many free blacks in the North were sold into slavery in the South, people who had never been enslaved. And so that was one of the first things that many people thought about, right, is that, we're now under this era in America where everyone who is not, lily white is going to be subject to questioning about who they are and forced to show papers and try to prove who they are. And, the way that this is all written out right now, there's no right to trial. There's no due process here.
Well, one of the things I've always thought about the Fugitive Slave Act and its role in American history was it basically said to the northern states without slavery, it's almost as if it took everybody in the country and said, none of you can pretend any longer that you aren't morally culpable for slavery because it is in your backyard, it is in your community, it is, even if you live in a so-called free state, it's now clear that you're part of one country that conducts this horrific practice, and you can't pretend you don't have moral responsibility for it. And I feel almost as if expedited removal should be a reminder to everyone that the horrific things happening in the name of ICE and deportation and border security, they're not just some distant federal government, they're not just what happens along a so-called wall on the southern border of the country. It's something that we all bear responsibility for stopping. I don't know, maybe I'm taking it too far.
No, I think you're absolutely right. So part of that act, of the Fugitive Slave Act, actually criminalizes people who don't go along with the act, who don't actually, go after and arrest or imprison people that they suspect could possibly be an escaped slave, an enslaved person. And so you see kind of a slippery slope happening here where it not only do you have to accept slavery, but you are now brought in to, the system of slavery itself as a deputy. Essentially, you're deputized to have to go out and do something. Even if you don't want to do it, you've got to be the police now. You're in a police state, and you're either going to be the police or you're going to be the policed.
Yeah, or as Bob Dylan said, it's all one big prison yard. Some of us are prisoners and some of us are guards. It's basically making those of us who are not prisoners the guards. And so what else were you thinking of in terms of your allusion to the 1850s and expedited removal, besides the Fugitive Slave Act?
Well, part of it is this doctrine, this legal doctrine called Posse Comitatus. And back in the 19th century, it's very different than the way we use it today. It was actually used by sheriffs and deputies all throughout the South, especially at this time, to basically tell any propertied white man, any man who had any kind of investment in slavery, that they had the power to help out the local sheriffs and basically police the entire area. And eventually, of course, after emancipation, this doctrine extends to all white men in the South. So essentially, all white men are part of this police force, constantly going around harassing and terrorizing Black people, trying to make them prove who they are, make them prove who they are racially. But it also reminded me of the slave patrols in the South, right? Sally Haddon has a great book on slave patrols. And not only do they start out really policing and terrorizing, every Black person in the region, but eventually by the 1840s and 50s, when there's a lot of interracial interaction between poor whites and enslaved Blacks and even free Blacks, they start actually policing poor whites as well. And so I think that we have to remember that there's always a class dynamic to this as well. And white people in particular, poor white people, working class white people, white people who may be LGBT, anybody who does not fit within the traditional confines of what elite whites want to see with this regime that we have now, will eventually be subject to search and seizure and asked to prove essentially their whiteness. You've got to prove who you are.
Well, and I want to get into that because that was part of what you were alluding to in your follow-up quote. But when you were talking about Posse Comitatus, I also thought of these militias that patrol the border on their own. That, from what I understand, the Border Patrol was taking a very hands-off, distancing attitude towards these these volunteer forces who choose to go out into the desert and try to find people trying to get into this country and round them up, terrorize them, brutalize them, and then turn them over to the authorities. But now my understanding is they're in effect the Posse Comitati of the present, right? I mean, they're being brought into this or brought into it now and collaborating, and that seems to me a definite echo of the slave patrols of the past. Or is that correct?
That's correct, completely. I write about this in my book, Masterless Men, a good bit, that eventually, especially in the 1850s, as Southern slaveholders realized that there's a possibility of secession and civil war eventually, they really start not only having slave patrols ride with greater frequency, but they start these other vigilance committees, these vigilante societies. They're called Minutemen groups or vigilance committees, and they go around and basically police the entire neighborhood, Black and white. Again, everyone's subject to be searched and terrorized and questioned. And really what you see is that the same group of elite men and their allies, the middling classes who are trying to make it up into elite society, these are the men that are not only running the criminal justice system, but they're also running these vigilante groups, right? They're the ones populating and leading all of these things. And so you see the criminal justice system working hand in hand with vigilante justice, and the systems kind of end up buttressing each other and propping each other up, especially where there's not a legal remedy that's quick enough to really terrorize these people and get them out of society as quickly as possible.
So where I go with this is to thinking that, and again, we're talking with historian and writer Keri Leigh Merritt, and for those of you who are listening rather than watching, it's Kerileigh Merritt. Where I go with this immediately is that, well, it seems like one good way to manipulate and control economically oppressed people, at least economically oppressed white people, is by in drafting or inducting them into the process of oppressing people of color or other groups in general. Was this a tool, in effect, of control of an oppressed group?
Oh, always. I mean, you see this time and time again throughout history. I think one thing we have to remember is that anger is a secondary emotion, right? Anger comes from pain and sadness. And so you've got a lot of strife in white America, and especially in rural white America and Rust Belt, these areas that did vote for Trump. These are areas where people are dying, they're in pain, they're committing suicide, they're addicted to opioids, and nothing is being done right now. Nothing is even being done to acknowledge their pain. And so their anger at their own situation in life is very easily kind of bottled and led into whatever function the elites want to lead them in. And of course, the easiest way to divide poor and working class people in our society is through racism. And it has always, always worked. Whenever there's a biracial coalition of working class and poor people, elites come in and start, lighting this incendiary racial fire, telling poor and working class whites how people of color are going to destroy their lives, are going to take their jobs, rape their wives and daughters. It's the same playbook. It's the same exact playbook from the slaveholders of the 1850s.
And then, as you pointed out in a stage whisper in your second tweet on this subject, by the way, white people, what happens under these types of laws is they start asking you to prove your whiteness. That opens up such a whole range of, resonant ideas. But what were you thinking of there?
Well, again, during this time when you're having this kind of crisis of racial identity in the Deep South, where you're supposed to have this, dividing line between white and free and black and slave. And you see all of these different legal cases, these court cases coming up in the 40s and 50s, where judges are actually trying to decide the racial classifications of all these different types of people. And not only is it enslaved people and free blacks arguing that they're actually, white or free, you see a lot of poor whites. A lot of poor whites are arguing that they have been captured and sold into slavery. This actually happens very commonly with poor white women. Men come into their town, they offer to marry them. We're going to take you away to a good life, take them to the next town and sell them into slavery. And part of the reason this is because they worked in agriculture, because they worked outside, they had, darkened skin. And part of it is because there's so much racial intermixture in America, right. Period. There always has been. It's something we still don't acknowledge enough, that, if you're a white person in the South, if your family's been here for generations and generations, you probably have some Western African blood in you as well. I mean, it's such a mixed society. And when you really think about, when you've got the police knocking at your door, how are you going to prove how white you are?
Yeah, it's a fascinating area. And then, of course, I mean, I think if you look at the ancestral mix of the South at the time, I would guess, besides Western African, you had European, probably primarily British Isles and so on. But now, if we go back down that road, which seems to be what you're suggesting, but if we were to go down that road now, I mean, you get into, well, of course, the historian who wrote, the history of whiteness, the concept of whiteness, the great African American, who was it, William Allen, or I'm blanking now, but
Nell Irvin Painter wrote a book like that as well. Yeah.
Yeah, and so you get into the whole history of, well, if you start to, 3 of my 4 grandparents are immigrants. 2 were refugees. I mean, would someone, I'm clearly, presented as white. Would someone ever challenge that? Would they challenge, probably unlikely, I guess, but would they challenge somebody whose ancestors came from southern Italy as opposed to northern Italy and a generation ago, as opposed to 3 generations? Is that the kind of Pandora's box you're suggesting might be opened?
I think, given the 3 years I've been now watching the Trump campaign, presidency, rhetoric, knowing who his advisors are, I think that's entirely possible. Every historian worth his or her salt right now, has been screaming this kind of into the void, unfortunately. But yeah, this is this kind of world we're looking at. We're on a slippery slope right here. And as soon another part of this law is that they're going to be building more detention centers, right? They're building more detention centers. So they're obviously getting ready to really amp this up.
Well, that's a good point, and I have to tell you, the rhetoric of racism that underlies this. One of the things that's so bizarre about this historical moment for me is that it's being spewed by some people who are traditionally the targets of white nationalism. I mean, I think of a Stephen Miller in the White House who's Jewish. Two of my four grandparents were Jewish. I was raised in a Jewish milieu, and pretty much, and well, except for the time I lived with Southern Baptist relatives, but that's a whole other thing. But the point being that my Jewish grandparents could never have conceived of the idea of a Jewish person in a White House like this one espousing these policies and flirting with the rhetoric of white nationalism. So I just wonder what happens. Is there a reckoning coming where the hardcore white nationalists who want nothing to do with a Stephen Miller or his family or his religion come into conflict with the kind of soft para-white nationalists like Miller? What is this? What the heck is going on, Keri Leigh?
It's so odd. It's so strange to watch, surreal. But I mean, you see the same thing that African Americans are screaming about Candace Owens and those kind of people. I think there have always been grifters throughout history. There have always been people who see an opportunity to make something for themselves, get famous, make a lot of money, and I don't know if all of these people who are of different races or religions, whatever, if they really believe this rhetoric or if it's all one big scam and they're just taking it to the bank. But that seems the most likely to me, honestly. I don't know how you could think that about your own family.
Yeah, no, it's horrifying. And by the way, I was thinking of Theodore Allen, the historian, and all this. But so where do you see it? We got about a minute left. Where do you see all this headed, or is it just you're watching with stunned amazement like the rest of us?
I'm watching in stunned amazement. I'm trying to do something. We've got to start really trying to talk to white people in this country and really get out the message that this is not going to be good for you if you're working class, if you're middle class, if you're poor in America. These are not the policies that are going to help you out. Take race out of the picture for a minute and think about what these policies are going to do to your lives.
Yeah, I think that's a great conclusion. And Keri Leigh Merritt, historian and author, thanks for that. And thanks, as always, for coming on the program.
Thanks so much. Have a good day.